What happens when a trusted friend becomes your worst nightmare, and the very person you turn to for love becomes the one who takes your life? Welcome to SherlockMode. September 6, 2010. The warm evening air of Toronto's gay village carried the sound of laughter and music from the bustling nightclubs. Skandaraj Navaratnam, known to his friends as Skanda, stepped out of Zipper's nightclub, his favorite spot in the neighborhood. The 40-year-old Sri Lankan refugee had found his home in this welcoming community after fleeing his homeland in the 1990s. Little did anyone know, this would be the last time Skanda would be seen alive. Skanda was not just any ordinary person. He was the heart and soul of every gathering, a man whose infectious laugh could light up an entire room. His friend Jody Becker, a bartender at Zipper's, once said that if Skanda started laughing, everybody started laughing, even if nothing was funny. He was educated, curious about global affairs, and absolutely unbeatable at Scrabble. For someone who had fled his country seeking safety and acceptance, Skanda had truly found his place in the world. But as the days passed after that September evening, something felt terribly wrong. Skanda's friends began to worry when he didn't show up for their usual hangouts. The worry turned to panic when they discovered something heartbreaking at his apartment. There, alone and abandoned, was a tiny puppy that Skanda had just adopted. The man who was always there for his friends, who never missed a chance to help others, had left his new pet without food or water. 10 days after Skanda was last seen, his friends made the call that would change everything. They contacted the Toronto police, reporting their beloved friend as missing. The officers who responded had no idea they were about to stumble into one of Canada's most horrifying serial killer cases. What seemed like a simple missing person report would eventually uncover a web of terror that had been growing in the shadows for years. As the investigation began, detectives learned about Skanda's connections within the gay village. He was well-known, well-liked, and had many friends. But there was one relationship that would prove to be crucial to understanding his disappearance. Since the early 2000s, Skanda had known a man named Bruce McArthur. They had even dated for a period. McArthur was a 50-something landscaper who worked in the upscale neighborhoods of Toronto. To most people, he seemed like a friendly, ordinary man. But not everyone saw McArthur as harmless. Kevin Nash, one of Skanda's close friends, would later reveal a chilling encounter he had with Skanda in 2009, just 1 year before the disappearance. Nash had run into Skanda at a gay bathhouse in Toronto, and something was deeply wrong. Skanda, who was usually so confident and cheerful, looked scared and was hiding. When Nash asked him what was happening, Skanda couldn't even look him in the eyes. Nash pressed his friend for answers. Was Bruce hurting him? Skanda said no, but admitted he was afraid of Bruce's violent behavior. This conversation would haunt Nash for years to come. Here was his friend, clearly in distress, clearly afraid of someone they both knew. But at the time, Nash had no idea just how dangerous Bruce McArthur really was. None of them did. As weeks turned into months, Skanda's disappearance remained a mystery. The Toronto police investigated, but leads were scarce. Then, something alarming happened. In December 2010, just 3 months after Skanda vanished, another man from the gay village disappeared. Abdulbasir Faizi, a 42-year-old married father of 2, simply vanished without a trace. The community began to whisper, could these disappearances be connected? The whispers grew louder in 2012 when a third man, Majid Khan, disappeared from the same area. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. 3 men, all from the gay village, all gone without explanation. The community demanded answers, and finally, the Toronto police responded. They launched a special task force called Project Houston, dedicated to investigating these mysterious disappearances. Project Houston was supposed to be the answer the community was hoping for. A dedicated team of detectives working around the clock to find these missing men and bring them home safely. The task force had resources, manpower, and the full support of the Toronto Police Service. But after 18 long months of investigation, Project Houston was quietly shut down. No arrests had been made. No bodies had been found. The cases remained unsolved. The closure of Project Houston sent shockwaves through the gay village. How could 3 men simply vanish without leaving any trace? How could a dedicated police task force work for 18 months and come up with nothing? The community felt abandoned, forgotten, and afraid. Many began to wonder if the police truly cared about finding these missing men, or if their status as gay immigrants made them less important in the eyes of law enforcement. But the disappearances didn't stop with the closure of Project Houston. Between 2012 and 2017, more men vanished from the gay village. Salim Eason, Andrew Kinsman, Dean Lisowick, Sarush Mahmoodi, and Karushna Kanagaratnam all disappeared under similar circumstances. The community lived in growing fear, knowing that somewhere out there, a predator was hunting them. Yet the police seemed powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, Bruce McArthur continued his work as a landscaper. He tended to gardens in Toronto's wealthiest neighborhoods, creating beautiful outdoor spaces for his clients. He was trusted with keys to their homes, access to their properties, and even storage space for his equipment. To everyone who knew him professionally, Bruce was reliable, skilled, and completely trustworthy. But beneath this carefully crafted exterior, a monster was hiding in plain sight. The breakthrough in the case came in an unexpected way. In January 2018, nearly 8 years after Skanda's disappearance, Toronto police received a tip about suspicious activity involving Bruce McArthur and a potential new victim. Officers decided to investigate, and what they discovered would change everything. On January 18, 2018, they arrested the 66-year-old landscaper on charges of first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Toronto. Bruce McArthur, the quiet landscaper who had worked in the city's most prestigious neighborhoods for years, was accused of being a serial killer. But this was just the beginning. As police began to search properties connected to McArthur's landscaping business, they made a discovery that would haunt investigators for months to come. In the garden planters that McArthur used for his landscaping work, police found human remains. Not just one victim, but multiple victims. The beautiful planters that had once held flowers and decorative plants had become makeshift graves for McArthur's victims. The very tools of his trade, the containers he used to create beauty in people's gardens, had been used to hide the evidence of his horrific crimes. As the investigation continued, the full scope of McArthur's crimes became clear. He had targeted vulnerable men from the gay village, particularly immigrants and refugees who had few connections and might not be immediately missed. These were men who had come to Canada seeking safety and acceptance, only to fall victim to a predator who exploited their trust and vulnerability. On February 23, 2018, more than 7 years after his disappearance, Skanda Navaratnam was finally found. Police announced that they had identified his remains from one of the planters seized from a property where McArthur stored his landscaping equipment. The man whose laugh could light up a room, who was unbeatable at Scrabble, who had found safety and love in Toronto's gay village, had been hidden away in a gardening container for almost 8 years. The evidence against McArthur continued to mount. During their search of his bedroom, police found a silver bracelet that had belonged to Skanda. This small piece of jewelry became a crucial piece of evidence, directly linking the killer to his first victim. It was a reminder that these weren't just random crimes, but deeply personal acts of violence against men McArthur had known and claimed to care about. As the investigation expanded, police revealed the truly staggering scope of their work. They were now examining hundreds of unsolved cases and missing person reports. The detective in charge stated that the investigation would likely continue for years, not months. They were tracing McArthur's whereabouts as far back as possible, and for the first time, they confirmed that their investigation extended beyond Canada's borders. The community that had been living in fear for nearly 8 years finally had answers, but those answers came with unimaginable pain. Kevin Nash, Skanda's friend who had noticed his fear of McArthur back in 2009, was devastated. He struggled with guilt, wondering if he could have done something to save his friend. The tragedy had shattered the sense of safety and trust that had once defined the gay village. The revelation that McArthur had been operating undetected for so long raised serious questions about the initial investigation. Why had Project Houston been shut down without finding answers? Why had the pattern of disappearances not led to earlier suspicion of McArthur? The community demanded accountability, wanting to know how a serial killer had been allowed to operate in their neighborhood for nearly 8 years. As more details emerged about McArthur's methods, a chilling picture began to form. He had used his position as a landscaper to gain access to properties where he could dispose of evidence. He had targeted men who were marginalized in multiple ways, not just because of their sexuality, but often because they were immigrants, refugees, or dealing with homelessness and substance abuse. These vulnerabilities made them perfect victims for a predator who knew how to exploit trust. The psychological profile of Bruce McArthur revealed a man who had lived a double life for decades. On the surface, he was a respected businessman, a grandfather, someone who contributed to his community. But beneath this facade was a calculating killer who had spent years planning and executing his crimes. He had maintained relationships with many men in the gay village, using these connections to identify potential victims. The investigation revealed that McArthur had been incredibly methodical in his approach. He had photographed his victims, keeping trophies of his crimes. These disturbing images would later be used as evidence in court, providing undeniable proof of his guilt. The photographs showed the victims in their final moments, a discovery that devastated their families and friends who had to learn of their loved one's fate through such horrific evidence. As the months passed, McArthur was charged with additional murders. The final count reached 8 victims: Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, Majid Kayhan, Salim Ezan, Andrew Kinsman, Dean Lisowit, Sarush Mahmoodi, and Karushna Navaratnam. Each name represented not just a statistic, but a life cut short, dreams unfulfilled, and families left to grieve without understanding why their loved one had been targeted. The impact on Toronto's LGBTQ community was profound and lasting. Many people reported feeling unsafe, unable to trust new relationships, or even venture out to the spaces that had once felt like home. The gay village, which had been a beacon of acceptance and safety for decades, now carried the shadow of these horrific crimes. The sense of community that had taken years to build was damaged in ways that would take much longer to heal. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the evidence was overwhelming. Faced with undeniable proof of his crimes, including DNA evidence, photographic evidence, and personal belongings of victims found in his possession, McArthur made a decision that surprised many. Rather than force the families and community through a lengthy trial, he chose to plead guilty to all 8 counts of first-degree murder. On January 29, 2019, Bruce McArthur appeared in court and formally pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. The plea meant he would receive an automatic life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. At 67 years old, this was essentially a death sentence. The man who had stolen so many lives would spend the rest of his own life behind bars, never again able to harm anyone. The guilty plea brought some measure of closure to the families and community, but it also meant that many questions would never be answered. Why had McArthur chosen these particular victims? What had driven him to commit such heinous acts? Had there been warning signs that were missed? The lack of a trial meant that the full details of his crimes and motivations would remain largely hidden from public view. During the sentencing hearing, victim impact statements painted a heartbreaking picture of the lives that had been lost. Skanda's friends spoke of his infectious laugh, his kindness, his intelligence. Other victims were remembered for their generosity, their dreams, their love for their families. These statements served as a powerful reminder that behind the sensational headlines were real people who had been beloved by those who knew them. The investigation also revealed how close McArthur had come to claiming a 9th victim. On the day of his arrest, police had intervened just in time to save another man who was reportedly with McArthur. This near miss highlighted how active the killer had remained right up until his capture, and how many more lives might have been lost if the investigation had taken even a few more weeks to reach its conclusion. The case prompted significant changes in how Toronto police handle missing person cases, particularly those involving marginalized communities. New protocols were put in place to ensure that patterns of disappearances would be identified more quickly, and that investigations would not be prematurely closed without thorough examination of all possible connections between cases. For the families of the victims, the conviction brought justice but not peace. Many had spent years not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, holding on to hope that they might still be alive somewhere. Learning the truth about their fate was devastating, but it also allowed them to finally begin the process of grieving and healing that had been impossible while their loved ones' fates remained unknown. The international scope of the investigation revealed that McArthur had traveled to other countries, raising concerns about whether he might have committed crimes elsewhere. Police worked with international partners to trace his movements and investigate any suspicious disappearances or unsolved cases in places he had visited. This global dimension added another layer of complexity to an already massive investigation. The story of Project Houston and the McArthur case became a cautionary tale about the importance of taking missing person reports seriously, especially when they involve vulnerable populations. It highlighted how societal prejudices and assumptions can interfere with proper police work, and how the failure to recognize patterns can have deadly consequences for communities that are already at risk. As we analyze this case, several critical factors stand out. First, the warning signs were there. Kevin Nash's observation of Skanda's fear in 2009 should have been taken more seriously. Second, the pattern of disappearances from a specific community should have triggered a more thorough investigation earlier. Third, McArthur's access to disposal sites through his landscaping business was a crucial factor that wasn't initially considered by investigators. The success of McArthur's crimes for nearly 8 years relied on several factors. His carefully maintained public persona as a respectable businessman, his targeting of marginalized victims who might not be immediately missed, his professional access to properties for body disposal, and perhaps most importantly, the initial failure of the justice system to recognize the connections between the disappearances and take them seriously enough to pursue a thorough investigation. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, like and subscribe to Sherlock Mode.